darling viewers, it's Jen here at Check Her Joy, and this time I'm doing another top 10 list. This time it is 10 classic books that have happy endings or otherwise light-hearted or comedic. So the inspiration for this list comes from my aunt, who is currently trying to make her way through a list of top 25 classic novels that everyone should read. And the first 4 books she read were all really depressing. So she was like, I think I need a break. And I'm like, or you could read a classic novel with a happy ending. So at the time, I could only think of Jane Austen and nothing else. So here are 10 classic novels or authors that are happier, lighter, more fun to read, and not going to leave you utterly depressed. So the first one on my list is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. This one follows the 4 March sisters and also their friends and family around them. So they have their mother, Marmee, and their dad, and their next door neighbor, Laurie. And basically it follows them from the time that they are children to young adulthood, and they just get into all these crazy, zany adventures, which I love. Especially the younger years are sweet and heartwarming. There is a major character death in this book, though, which makes it a little bit depressing, but the book ends on a happy note, so I think it's still pretty heartwarming and light, despite the death. But that's why it's at the bottom of the list, is because of that one thing. One thing. Also, apparently, the original version of this book ends earlier and does not have that death. Similarly, I have North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This one follows Margaret Hale, who ends up moving from the country to a northern industrial city, and it's a complete culture shock for her. The pacing of the town is different, the way people act is different. Everybody in the country is all calm and chill, and when she gets to the city, everybody's busy and trying to survive, basically. She also keeps running into Mr. Thornton, who owns one of the cotton mills in town and is generally regarded to be kind of brash. So her father is tutoring Mr. Thornton, so she keeps running into him, and so there's a romance in it. This one is another one that has kind of a massive death in the middle of the book, but the ending in the book is still happy, so I like this one. I also picked Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, another one that ends on a happy note, but you gotta get through a lot of struggles to get there. So Jane comes from a somewhat wealthy family, but her aunt disowns her, so she ends up being poor. And so she ends up becoming the governess in this house, and she runs into Mr. Rochester, who owns the house, and they have a romance. It's really sweet, but all kinds of crazy, insane things happen in this book. Some of it's a bit grim and dark, it's kind of gothic, but the ending is pretty happy, and I love it. I love Jane Eyre. She's, perfect. Every decision that Jane makes is spot on, even if I wouldn't make the same decision she did, she made the right choice. Then I have gone for some children's books, particularly Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the second book, Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. These follow a young girl, Alice, as she goes through a rabbit hole, ends up in this crazy, zany world called Wonderland, where the rules are all completely different, and eventually finds her way out. But I just love how insane Wonderland is, and the imagery of it, and the way that it plays on words, and things that we're used to. So I love Alice in Wonderland. It is a children's book, though, so I don't know how strict you want to be with your definition of, classics. But it's definitely a classic, it's just a children's one. That makes sense, alright? So another children's book that I really adore is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. Anne is an orphan, and she gets taken into the house of Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert, who originally didn't want her. They were expecting a boy to come help work on their farm, but once Anne shows up, she's just so endearing that they can't send her back. And Anne is another one who has tons of crazy adventures that are charming and sweet, and this book series follows Anne through adulthood. So while the first book follows her as a child, she does eventually grow up and have the family, and I love it. I've only read books 1 and 2, though. Next on my list is a play. It is The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. Actually, most of Oscar Wilde's books are incredibly funny and humorous, and I love them terribly, but the plays Importance of Being Earnest and also An Ideal Husband are both wonderful and perfect, and I love them. I like The Importance of Being Earnest. It's a slight bit more, so that's why I picked it. So if you want some fun, classic, romantic, farce comedies, these are absolutely delightful. And I love the wording, and the language in these is so wonderful, and the characters are so rich. Love them. The Importance of Being Earnest follows Jack, who has these dual lives, one in the country and one in the city, and he always uses this fictional friend, Ernest, to tell people that he needs to, like, leave and go home and take care of Ernest. Until one day his friend Algernon shows up in the country and tells everybody that he is Ernest, and particularly Jack's ward Cecily starts falling in love with Algernon, and the whole point of the play is, like, who's actually Ernest and the importance of that name. Also, as a play on words for being earnest is being truthful. I love it. This is so witty. Then I have The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. Actually, all of Mark Twain's books are pretty much funny and wonderful, with great characters and funny dialogue and really interesting scenarios. The Prince and the Pauper I picked because it's pretty short. You can get through it quickly, and just everything about it is wonderful. So in this story, we have the Prince of England, the Crown Prince of England, and he's bemoaning his life in the palace. It's so hard, woe is him. And then there is this boy, a pauper on the street, who is starving and mistreated, and he also doesn't like his life. And when the prince finds out that this pauper looks exactly like him, the two decide to switch places. And the fun of this book is what happens when they switch and how they see each other's lives. So this one is charming and sweet, and the importance of responsibility and being yourself, I guess. So the next book on my list is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. This follows the young Jim Hawking. I think he's around a teenager, maybe. Anyway, a pirate map ends up in his hands, and he manages to secure a ship and crew, and they go looking for the pirates' treasure. There are also pirates that infiltrate the ship, and we have the infamous Long John Silver in this book. I just love the adventure with the pirates and everything, and it's great. It's a pretty happy ending and sweet, and I have read this book so many times. I actually own 3 copies of this book. I really love Treasure Island, guys. Super love it. Everything about Treasure Island is wonderful. So, I highly recommend this one too. All the adventure is just so much fun and engaging and great. And everything just is a little bit not what you're expecting, but also love it. So my next recommendation is Shakespeare's comedies. This is Much Ado About Nothing, which is my absolute favorite play ever. I will admit that Shakespeare is kind of hard to get through. The language is 400 years old. We don't necessarily talk that way anymore. It's kind of a struggle, but I adore it, and I think it's wonderful, and it holds up great still. This is the Folger editions, which I super love because they have great explanatory notes telling you what each of the words mean and situations and the historical context of them. So I super love the notes. They are incredibly useful. So any of Shakespeare's comedies are great and wonderful. And in fact, most of Shakespeare's plays have a wonderful comedic part to them. It's just that the comedies end up on these happy, wonderful notes. So if you're looking for happy endings. Much Ado About Nothing is my favorite. It follows these 2 sets of lovers. One is Beatrice and Benedict, who have known each other for a while, had a failed romance, and now pretty much hate each other's guts. But they have this skirmish of wits between them that is super funny, as they're always insulting each other, and I love it. They are my favorite Shakespeare couple ever. They are wonderful. We also have Claudio and Hero, who meet for the first time, and it is love at first sight. However, Claudio hears a rumor that Hero has not been true, and calls her out in public, and this results in this huge scandal, and Hero's name is besmirched, and it ends up with this thing where Hero fakes being dead to try to make Claudio realize the mistake he made and how much he actually loves her, and it's a comedy. It all ends up well, but I just love the comical farce that's going on with the fake death, and I also really love Beatrice and Benedict. Like, the 2 of them. Any scene either one of them is in, and especially the scenes where it's just the 2 of them, my favorites. And then the ones that immediately popped to mind when I was like, hey, you need to read a happy ending, was Jane Austen. So any of Jane Austen's novels, they all end happily. It's just that Mansfield Park and Emma are my favorite, so I picked Mansfield Park and won out slightly this time. In Mansfield Park, we have Fanny Price, and her family is poor and a large family, so her aunt and uncle agree to take her in. And so she is raised with her cousins and is sort of part of the family, but also sort of everybody knows that she's the cousin and she doesn't have wealth. Her Cousin Edmund is particularly nice to her and wonderful, and they become best friends, and I love the two of them together. And then everything kind of turns upside down when this brother and sister move in next door, Mary and Henry Crawford, and they are both charming rogues, basically, and shake things up. And everybody basically falls in love with Henry. So tons and tons of romantic parts happening in here. But I really love Edmund and Fanny. They're my favorite part of this book and why I recommend this one more. Those were my top 10 picks for books that are happy, light, endearing, heartwarming stories. Ones that aren't going to leave you completely and utterly depressed. Let me know in the comments below what are your favorite lighter, happier, classic novels and books. What do you recommend? Do you agree or disagree with any of the books on my list? And have you read any of them? Because these are pretty much my favorites, as you can tell by the fact that I own every single one of these books. Peace out. I love you guys and keep reading. Bye!